Late 2032. That's the date the Social Security Administration's own trustees published just a few weeks ago in their official 2026 report as the point when the retirement trust fund is projected to run out of money. I want to walk through exactly what that actually means for your check, because the headlines have been alarming, some of the social media takes have been outright misleading, and the truth sits somewhere considerably more nuanced than either extreme. I'm Michelle Park, and I want to give you the real numbers, the real mechanics, and the real history here, because I think this topic deserves precision rather than either panic or false reassurance. Let me start with exactly what the trustees said, because the specific language matters. The Old Age and Survivors Insurance Trust Fund, the one that pays retirement and survivor benefits, is projected to deplete its reserves in the fourth quarter of 2032. That's 3 months earlier than last year's projection of 2033, and the trustees attribute part of that acceleration specifically to the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, passed in 2025, which the Social Security Administration's own chief actuary said would have what he called material effects on the program's finances, because it reduced how much revenue comes in from taxing benefits. Here's the critical part almost nobody explains clearly enough. Depletion of the trust fund does not mean Social Security runs out of money entirely and stops paying anything. It means the trust fund's reserves, the savings account built up over decades, would be exhausted. At that point, the program would still be collecting payroll taxes from current workers, and those incoming taxes would still fund benefits, just not at the full, currently scheduled level. The trustees' own projection is that incoming revenue alone would cover 78% of scheduled benefits, which works out to an automatic 22% reduction in monthly checks if Congress does nothing between now and then. I want to be precise about something else, because this is where I see the most confusion online. If you combine the retirement trust fund with the separate disability insurance trust fund, which remains healthy and is actually projected to be solvent for the full 75-year period covered by the report, the combined depletion date moves to the third quarter of 2034, at which point 83% of benefits would be payable instead of 78%. Combining these two funds, though, would require an act of Congress. It's not something that happens automatically, and it's a separate political decision from simply allowing each fund to run on its own track. Let me put real dollars on what a 22% cut would actually mean. The average retiree's monthly benefit in 2026 is approximately $2,071. A 22% reduction works out to roughly $455 less per month, which lines up closely with independent analysis from the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, estimating an average cut of around $500 monthly. For a typical retired couple, the same analysis projects an annual reduction exceeding $18,000 combined. Now, here's something genuinely important to understand about why this date keeps moving, because it's not simply a single new problem that appeared out of nowhere. The trustees identified 3 specific factors behind this year's earlier projection. First, lower birth rates, with the assumed fertility rate dropping from 1.9 to 1.75 children per woman, which the trustees say accounts for more than half of the deterioration in the outlook. Fewer future workers paying into the system, relative to the number of beneficiaries drawing from it, is the single largest driver. Second, reduced immigration assumptions, lowering the projected number of both legal, temporary, and undocumented immigrants entering the workforce each year, which similarly reduces the projected base of future payroll tax contributors. Third, and this is the piece tied to recent legislation specifically, the One Big Beautiful Bill Act's expansion of the senior tax deduction reduced the amount of Social Security benefit income subject to taxation, which in turn reduced one of the revenue streams that feeds the trust fund, worsening the actuarial balance by an estimated 0.16% of payroll, and pulling the depletion date forward by roughly a year on its own. I want to address something specific here, because I think it's genuinely useful context rather than just alarming trivia. This isn't the first time trustees have projected a depletion date in this general range. Since the early 2000s, trustees' reports have consistently projected depletion dates somewhere between 2033 and 2036. The window has been narrowing gradually for well over a decade, not suddenly appearing this year. According to retirement policy researchers, lawmakers have known the rough timeline for addressing this for years. And the real story isn't that this crisis appeared overnight. It's that years of congressional inaction have steadily compressed the amount of time, and therefore the range of gentler options available to fix it. This matters because it changes how I think you should interpret this news. 20 years ago, smaller, more gradual adjustments could have addressed the long-term shortfall with relatively modest changes spread across decades. The longer Congress waits, the more abrupt and significant any eventual fix needs to be, simply because there's less runway left to phase changes in gently. Let me walk through what Congress could actually do, because there are genuinely several options on the table, none of which involve Social Security simply vanishing. The most straightforward fix, often discussed, is raising or eliminating the cap on earnings subject to Social Security payroll tax. Currently, only earnings up to $184,500 are taxed for Social Security purposes in 2026. Raising or removing that cap entirely would bring in considerably more revenue from higher earners without affecting most workers' paychecks at all. A second option is increasing the payroll tax rate itself, currently set at 6.2% each, for employees and employers. Even a relatively small increase, phased in gradually, could meaningfully extend the program's solvency. A third option involves raising the full retirement age further, building on changes already made decades ago that gradually moved the age from 65 to 67 for everyone born in 1960 or later. A fourth option involves adjusting the benefit formula itself, potentially through a more progressive structure that protects lower-income beneficiaries more fully, while making somewhat larger adjustments for higher earners. The trustees themselves explicitly recommended in their report that lawmakers address this in a timely way, specifically to phase in necessary changes gradually, giving both workers and beneficiaries time to adjust, rather than facing a sudden, larger change later. Implementing changes sooner, in their own words, allows more generations to share in whatever combination of revenue increases or benefit adjustments ultimately gets chosen. I also want to address Medicare specifically, since the same trustees released a parallel report covering Medicare's hospital insurance trust fund, and the two often get confused or conflated in casual conversation. That fund faces its own, separate depletion date, projected for the second quarter of 2033, a quarter earlier than last year's estimate. If that fund were to deplete without action, it would be able to pay approximately 89% of its scheduled benefits, a smaller reduction than the Social Security Retirement Fund's projected cut, but a real one nonetheless, primarily affecting hospital and skilled nursing facility coverage, rather than your monthly Social Security check directly. Let me address the political reality here as well, because I think pretending this is purely a technical, apolitical issue would be dishonest. Social Security has long been considered, as policy analysts often describe it, the third rail of American politics, meaning it's an issue lawmakers from both parties have historically been extremely reluctant to touch, precisely because any specific fix involves either asking people to pay more, reducing what people receive, or some combination of both, all of which create genuine political risk. The current Social Security Commissioner acknowledged directly in front of a congressional subcommittee that his role was to make the program perform as well as possible so that lawmakers have a set of workable options. He was explicit that the actual solution rests with Congress, not with the agency itself. This is genuinely worth understanding clearly. The trust fund depletion date is not a decision anyone has made. It's a projection based on current law and current demographic and economic trends continuing unchanged. Whether Congress acts before 2032, and what specific combination of changes they eventually choose, remains entirely unresolved and unpredictable from where we stand today. Let me now address what I think actually matters most for you, watching this video right now, depending on where you are in your own journey toward or through retirement. If you're already receiving Social Security, or you're within the next 5 to 7 years of claiming, the honest, evidence-based answer is that even in the most pessimistic scenario, where Congress does absolutely nothing, you would still receive 78% of your currently scheduled benefit starting in late 2032, not zero. The program has never missed a scheduled payment in its entire history, and nothing in the Trustees Report changes that track record up to this point. Planning around the possibility of a meaningful reduction starting around 2032, rather than assuming either total catastrophe or that nothing will ever change, is the most realistic approach. If you're decades away from retirement, this is exactly the kind of long-term uncertainty that argues for building retirement savings outside Social Security as a genuine complement to it, rather than either ignoring the program entirely or assuming it alone will provide everything you need. This isn't new advice specific to this year's report. It's been sound financial planning guidance for a long time, and this report simply reinforces why that diversification matters. I also want to address something about how to follow this topic responsibly going forward, since this is exactly the kind of subject that attracts both genuine alarm and a lot of low-quality clickbait content designed to generate fear rather than understanding. The trustees' reports themselves are published directly by the Social Security Administration at ssa.gov, and organizations like AARP and the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget provide genuinely careful, well-sourced analysis of what these reports actually say. If you encounter a video, article, or social media post claiming Social Security is about to disappear entirely, or conversely, claiming there's nothing at all to be concerned about, both extremes are misrepresenting what the trustees actually said. Let me close with the complete, honest picture. The Social Security Retirement Trust Fund is genuinely projected to deplete its reserves in late 2032. If Congress takes no action whatsoever between now and then, benefits would face an automatic 22% reduction starting at that point, not elimination. Congress has multiple genuine policy tools available to prevent this, ranging from adjusting the payroll tax cap to modifying benefit formulas, and historically, even when depletion dates have approached in past decades, Congress has eventually acted, sometimes at the literal last moment, as happened with the bipartisan reforms passed in 1983. Whether that pattern repeats this time remains to be seen, but it's worth knowing as part of the full historical context, rather than assuming this situation is entirely unprecedented. If you take one thing away from today's video, I'd want it to be this. Verify what you hear about this topic against the actual trustees' report and credible, non-partisan analysis, rather than reacting to a headline or a 30-second video clip designed primarily to generate alarm or clicks. The real situation is serious and worth genuine attention from lawmakers, but it is also considerably more nuanced and less immediately catastrophic for anyone currently receiving benefits than the most viral framings of this story suggest. If this was useful, share it with someone you love who's seen alarming headlines about Social Security running out and wants to understand what's actually true, rather than just what's been shared the loudest. Let me go deeper into a few of these areas because the specifics genuinely change how you should think about your own planning. I want to address the history of Social Security reform in more detail because I think the 1983 reforms specifically offer a genuinely useful template for understanding how these situations have historically resolved. By the early 1980s, the trust fund was projected to actually run dry within months, an even more acute crisis than what we're discussing today. Congress, under a bipartisan commission led by Alan Greenspan, ultimately passed reforms that gradually raised the full retirement age from 65 to 67, brought new federal employees into the system, made a portion of benefits taxable for higher income recipients for the first time, and increased payroll tax rates incrementally. These changes weren't popular in the moment, but they extended the program's solvency for decades, and many of the specific mechanics we still operate under today, including the very full retirement age schedule that determines your own claiming decision, trace directly back to that legislation. I bring this up because it demonstrates that Congress has, at least once before, acted decisively when faced with genuine urgency, even on an issue as politically sensitive as this one. Whether that happens again before 2032 is genuinely uncertain, but it's not unprecedented, and the framing that nothing will ever be done isn't supported by the program's own history. I also want to address something specific about how the depletion date has moved over time, since understanding this pattern helps calibrate how much weight to put on any single year's projection. Trustees' reports have projected depletion somewhere in the 2033 to 2036 range consistently since the early 2010s. This year's report moved the date to late 2032, 3 months earlier than the 2025 projection. Next year's report could move the date again, in either direction, depending on updated economic data, demographic trends, and any legislative changes enacted in the meantime. These projections are genuinely sophisticated, multi-decade forecasts, but they are forecasts, sensitive to assumptions about fertility rates, immigration levels, wage growth, and interest rates that can shift from year to year. This doesn't mean the underlying concern isn't real. It means treating any single year's exact date as fixed and certain, rather than as the trustee's best current estimate, would be a mistake in either direction, whether you're inclined toward alarm or toward dismissal. Let me walk through the payroll tax cap option in more specific detail, since this is consistently one of the most discussed potential fixes, and understanding the actual mechanics helps clarify why it's debated the way it is. Currently, earnings above $184,500 aren't subject to Social Security payroll tax at all. Someone earning $500,000 a year pays the same total dollar amount of Social Security tax as someone earning exactly the cap amount, because everything above that threshold goes untaxed for this specific purpose. Raising or eliminating this cap would significantly increase revenue from higher earners specifically, without changing the tax burden at all for the substantial majority of workers whose income falls below the current cap. Various specific proposals exist with different cap levels and different treatment of whether benefits would also increase proportionally for those paying more, which is part of why this remains a genuinely debated policy question, rather than a simple, obvious fix, even though the basic mechanism itself is straightforward. I want to address the earnings cap from a slightly different angle as well, since it connects to something relevant for higher earning workers approaching retirement right now. If you're someone whose income exceeds the current cap, understanding that your effective Social Security tax rate, as a percentage of your total income, is already lower than for someone earning below the cap is worth knowing, simply as context for how the system currently functions, regardless of whether any future reform changes this structure. Let me also address something about state-level variation and how a potential benefit cut would land, since the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budgets analysis specifically found that the impact wouldn't be uniform across the country. Their research found that in 29 states, the dollar impact of a 22% cut would actually be higher than the national average $500 figure, reflecting regional differences in average benefit amounts, which themselves reflect differences in regional wage histories and cost of living during people's working years. If you live in a state with historically higher average wages, your own personal benefit amount, and therefore the dollar impact of any percentage cut, would likely be somewhat larger than the national average figure I cited earlier, simply because your benefit itself started from a larger base. I also want to spend time on something genuinely important for anyone in their 50s or early 60s right now: actively making claiming decisions. The trustees' projections and any eventual congressional response are about the program's overall structure and funding, not about retroactively changing benefits for people who've already claimed, or punishing any specific birth cohort directly. Historically, when Congress has made changes like the 1983 reforms, they've generally been phased in with advance notice, often affecting younger workers more than those already near or in retirement, specifically to avoid disrupting near-term retirement plans for people with limited remaining time to adjust. This is genuinely worth knowing if you're currently deciding when to claim, and you're worried that delaying your claim somehow exposes you to more risk from a future benefit cut. Historically, that hasn't been how these transitions have worked, though I'd encourage anyone making this decision to stay informed as actual legislative proposals, if any, develop over the coming years. Let me address something about Social Security disability insurance specifically, since I mentioned it's on considerably stronger financial footing, and I think it's worth explaining why, since the contrast itself is informative. The Disability Trust Fund has actually improved its financial position over the past decade, partly due to demographic shifts in disability application and approval rates, and partly due to past program integrity improvements. This stronger position is exactly why combining the two trust funds, retirement and disability, would extend the overall combined solvency date to 2034, with 83% of benefits payable, rather than the retirement fund's standalone 78% figure at the earlier 2032 date. The fact that combining funds requires explicit congressional action, rather than happening automatically, reflects that these are legally separate trust funds with separate purposes, even though they're managed by the same agency and reported on together each year. Let me close this deeper section with a thought I think genuinely matters beyond the specific numbers I've covered today. The trustees themselves describe their annual report's purpose as providing Congress, and by extension the public, with an accurate, professional accounting of the program's financial status, specifically so that informed decisions can be made with adequate time to implement them gradually. That's a fundamentally different purpose than generating headlines or social media engagement, even though the same underlying facts inevitably get repackaged into both forms. Understanding the actual report, the actual mechanics of how depletion would work, and the actual range of options available to Congress gives you something genuinely more useful than either panic or denial. It gives you an accurate picture you can use to plan your own retirement sensibly, advocate for whatever policy outcome you believe is fairest if you choose to engage politically politically on this issue, and evaluate future news coverage of this topic with the context to tell genuinely informative reporting, apart from content designed primarily to provoke a reaction. If this was useful, please share it with someone you love who's expressed genuine worry about Social Security's future, particularly if they've encountered alarming headlines without the fuller context this video has tried to provide. One final piece I want to address, because it's the question I get asked most directly whenever this topic comes up in conversation. Should you change your own claiming strategy right now because of this report? For most people, the honest answer is no, not because of this report specifically. The fundamentals of good claiming strategy, whether delaying to age 70 makes sense given your health and other resources, whether spousal or survivor benefit coordination matters for your household, whether you need income now versus later, remain essentially unchanged by this year's Trustees Report. The report describes a multi-year structural funding question for the program as a whole. It doesn't change the formula used to calculate your individual benefit amount, and it doesn't change the relative value of claiming at 62 versus 67 versus 70 for your own specific situation. What I would encourage, rather than a dramatic strategy change, is simply incorporating realistic awareness of this issue into your broader financial plan. If you're several years from claiming, building some flexibility into your retirement income sources, so you're not entirely dependent on Social Security functioning at 100% of currently scheduled levels, is sensible. If you're closer to claiming or already receiving benefits, understanding that even the most pessimistic, realistic scenario still involves receiving the substantial majority of your benefit, not losing it entirely, should inform a measured response rather than panic. I want to leave you with the specific resources worth bookmarking if you want to follow this topic accurately going forward. The Social Security Administration publishes the full Trustees Report directly at ssa.gov, along with summary fact sheets that translate the technical actuarial language into more accessible terms. AARP maintains ongoing, clearly written coverage specifically aimed at helping current and future beneficiaries understand what these reports mean for them personally. And the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget provides detailed, nonpartisan analysis of the specific policy options Congress could choose from, along with the trade-offs each option involves. The complete picture, one more time. Late 2032 is the projected depletion date for the Retirement Trust Fund specifically. 78% of scheduled benefits would remain payable from ongoing payroll tax revenue if Congress takes no action at all. Multiple genuine policy options exist to prevent this entirely or substantially reduce its impact. Congress has acted decisively on this exact issue before, in 1983, when the situation was arguably more acute than it is today. And nothing about your own individual benefit calculation or claiming strategy needs to change today specifically because of this report, though staying broadly informed and maintaining reasonable flexibility in your overall retirement planning remains sound practice regardless. If this gave you a clearer, calmer understanding of where things actually stand, that's exactly what I hope to accomplish today. Share it with anyone in your life who's been genuinely worried so they can plan from accurate information rather than fear. I'll see you in the next one.